Last time we were talking about the membrane potential, and let me remind you real quick that the cell surrounded by a membrane, there are ions outside, ions inside, positives and negatives outside, positives and negatives inside. Both of them have the same thing, but different amounts. Because of that difference, the inside is negative if compared to the outside. And exactly, it's minus 70. Okay, we call that the resting membrane potential. There is potential here. There is polarization, and that's normal to be different from inside to outside, negative inside than outside. And I told you guys that the sodium is the main extracellular cation and potassium is the main intracellular cation. So obviously, when you open the gates for sodium, it will rush in. If you open the gates for potassium, it will rush out. Concentration gradient, right? And open or leak channels, they don't need much. Anything that come, and this is the graded potential that I'm talking about, or local potential. Any stimulus that come, this open or leak channels will leak some sodium anyway, irrespective how small, how big. And this change, minor change, coming from the leak sodium channels is called graded potential or local potential. So graded or local potential resulting in a little bit of sodium moving in. What do we call that? Polarization. The polarized state is going to disappear, right? It was polarized. Now it is disappearing. We are removing the polarized state because of sodium moving in. Now the change that you created because of the sodium moving in down the leak channels, sodium channels. This change, which is the graded potential or local potential, this is either strong enough to open the gates completely, and if you open the gates for sodium, that's it. It will continue to rush in, rush in, rush in, rush in until you get to the equilibrium, right? So here is the graded potential. This is a local potential. This is a local change that is created when you stimulate the membrane. And this is due to leak sodium channels. And then if this leads to, or if it goes enough to minus 60, this is the threshold, the gated, chemically gated sodium channels are going to open. And we'll start the process of depolarization. So graded potential is that local current that's created because of the depolarization. How much is it? Again, it's all about the stimulus. Tiny stimulus, small local potential or graded potential. Stronger stimulus, bigger. How big? What's the difference? All or none. You either reach the threshold, strong enough to reach the threshold to bring you down to the threshold, or actually in this case, it's to bring you up because minus 70 to minus 60 are going up, right? So it will bring you up to the threshold. If that's the case, sodium channels open, you start the whole cycle. What if I didn't get to that magic number? Nothing is going to happen. All or none. Strong enough to open it and do the whole process, or not strong enough, nothing. All or none. So here it is, minus 70. You go to minus 65. You go to minus 60. Leak channels start to leak down. The local current come. These are the leak channels, start to leak in until you reach 60, minus 60. If you reach minus 60, this is depolarization. How about from 70 to 60? Depolarization. What's the difference? The first one, from minus 70 to minus 60, is local current, graded potential, leak channels, right? What happened exactly at minus 60? Gated sodium channels open, and you start the fast, the rapid depolarization. So you start slow until you get to that threshold. If you reach it, you go up suddenly, rapidly. So slow depolarization, rapid depolarization. And then repolarization. Re means again. Repolarize, you return back to the polarized state again. However, do you only reach the normal back? No, you exceed the normal. and we call that hyperpolarization. It's even more negative than what we started. We started minus 70. You can go down to minus 90. So that graded potential that's created, what starts that graded potential? It's different things depending on what type of a channel is it. Is it chemically gated? Is it electrically gated? Is it physically gated? Do you remember these different types of channels? So it all depends on what type. Like in this case for acetylcholine, this is chemically gated channels. Acetylcholine released, cross the gap, bind with acetylcholine receptors, and this will start a local current or graded potential that will ultimately reach the threshold, and you start the depolarization in the after the gap, post synapse. So now we are talking about the action potential and the different parts. I draw this yesterday, and I told you this is by far the most important part in this chapter. It doesn't mean all questions will come from here. It means it is the most important. Many questions expect to see the graph itself because it's extremely important. I want to make sure that you guys get this. If you don't get this, you didn't get the most important part. Okay, so you start with resting membrane potential, which is polarization, which is minus 70. A local stimulus come, graded potential created, goes down, it goes up from minus 70. If you go to minus 60, magic number. What's the event? Opening gated sodium channels. You'll be asked about each one point of these. Then you start rapid depolarization. What's the ionic explanation for the rapid depolarization? Rapid rush of sodium N, right? Until you reach that point. What is that point? The top. This is positive 30. Why? What happened at positive 30? Sodium channels start to close, potassium channels start to open. And this will lead to repolarization. Do you repolarize all the way down just to minus 70? No, you exceed it. You go even more. You go down to about minus 90, and then you reverse back and go to the minus 70 at the end. The threshold for the accent is minus 60 to minus 55. I told you guys minus 60. Yes, minus 60 to minus 55. It's usually something in between those. Minus 60 is good enough. But remember that both numbers that will be good. It's between minus 60 and minus 55. This is the threshold. And then what happened now? What happened is I created an action potential, which is this whole curve. This is called action potential, right? Starting from resting, slow, rapid, hyper, all of this together. This is called action potential. Action potential is electrical current that's already created in this neuron. What's going to happen to it? It's going to propagate. In which direction? In one direction only. Dendritis, body, initial segment, axon hillock, initial segment, and so on. It goes all the way until the synaptic terminals or the axon terminals that contain acetylcholine. Are we following? Contain acetylcholine in the vesicles. Calcium moves in, the vesicles release acetylcholine, cross the gap, interact with receptors, opening the gates for sodium one more time, and starting the process in the next neuron, and then propagate until the end. Same process, next neuron, and so on. This is how it goes. Here is the all or none principle that I talked about. The stimulus, either the stimulus is strong enough to reach the threshold, an action potential is triggered or started, or none. Waste. He didn't do anything if it is not strong enough. This is called all or none principle. And I mentioned everything here that I'm talking about is important. Otherwise, I would have skipped it. So here it is, depolarization, reach the threshold, activate voltage-gated sodium channels, sodium rush in, rapid depolarization until you reach the positive 30. And what's the positive 30? Sodium channels inactivate, potassium channels activate. Potassium move in. So what? Repolarization. So the whole thing is action potential. And then what? And then you reach all the way to the hyperpolarization. And again, you return back. It's keep on repeating, but I just want to make sure that you guys understand what I talked about. Hyperpolarization reached to what? Minus 90. All the numbers that I talked about is important. Minus 70, minus 60 to minus 55, positive 30, minus 90. All of these are important numbers to know. And you need to know what does it mean. After the action potential is over, it will start to propagate in one direction only, and the process is over. Over from what? Over from the electrical point of view only. Is it over in the chemical point of view? Not yet, right? Why? Because didn't you reverse the condition, right? Now it's flipped. What's the most abundant intracellular cation? Intracellular. Potassium. Extracellular. Sodium. When you do this action potential, it's reversed. Okay, so potassium is more outside and sodium is more inside. But you created the action potential, yes. And you reach the resting membrane potential again, yes. This is from the electrical point of view, but this still flipped. And that's not right because now you cannot do anything else. So you have to go back to normal chemically to be ready for the next cycle. Clear? Is that clear? How to do that? Reverse it. Sodium potassium ATPase. Remember this name. Sodium potassium ATPase. And what's the ratio? That you're returning it back to the original position. 2 to 3. Which one is 2? Which one is 3? Potassium is 2 and sodium is? Okay, that's great. All right. After the action potential is over, if another stimulus come, okay, if another stimulus come, do you guys remember this TREPE and summation, like the action potential is coming and contraction relaxation? Do you remember this? There is something like this here. So here it is. Resting, slow, rapid, reach the top, and then you go down, repolarize, hyperpolarize, right? What if after all of this and everything is over, another stimulus come? It's going to make another one, right? What if it come a little bit earlier? It still can create another one. What if it come earlier? Oh, so it all depends now on how early does it come. Remember that in the muscles? If it comes a little bit early, that's TREPE. If it comes earlier, summation, incomplete tetany, complete tetany. Do you remember this? So it all depends on the timing of the next stimulus coming. There is a certain part of the curve in which the nerve is not going to respond. And this is called refractory period. I will show you in the graph. So what's a refractory period? Period of refraction. What does it mean? The neuron is refractory. Translation, refusing. Refractory, refusing. The neuron is refractory, refusing to interact, refusing to respond. And we call that refractory period. Do you mean refractory period like absolutely refractory? No, there are two stages. There is absolute refraction and there is relative refraction. Refractory period. Absolute refractory period. At that time, all sodium channels are still open. So if another stimulus comes, nothing is going to happen. absolutely refractory. Why? Because if the stimulus comes, you're supposed to open the sodium and sodium moves in, right? Are we following? It's already in. It's already completely opened. What else can you do? Nothing, right? So this is called absolute refractory period because all voltage gated sodium channels already opened. There is absolutely no response. And that's why we call it absolute. There is another part though, if you come a little bit after that. Now, remember what happened when you go up all the way to the top? The sodium channel's inactive and then the potassium is active, right? And then the sodium channels, the sodium start to uh, reverse back. So there is a chance for response of the sodium channels, and we call that relative refractory period. What do you mean relative refractory period? Is it refractory or not refractory? It's relatively refractory, meaning if a stimulus come, it will refuse. But if this stimulus is strong enough, it can force it to work. Okay? Like this. Let me give you practical example. If this door, okay, if a child come over here and try to open the door, right? He will not be able to push it. A baby, right? But if he like push strong enough, he might end up opening it, right? Do you get what I mean? What if this is locked? Nothing, right? How about if he push it too hard? It's locked, right? Absolute refraction versus relative refraction. In relative refraction, you try, it doesn't work, it doesn't respond. But if you try more and stronger, it can, which that is what we call it absolute or relative refractory period. And if for every step, you need to know the ionic explanation. What's ionic explanation? For absolute, all sodium channels are already opened. So what else are you going to open? But relative channels start to regain back to normal. So not all of it. So it can respond if the stimulus is strong enough. Here is the whole thing here. And I mentioned it and I repeated several times how important this is. Everything in this graph, you should know it by heart. You should know this like all the details, including starting from the resting membrane potential to the graded potential coming to reaching to the minus 60, at which the gated sodium channels open. So what's the explanation for one? What's one? Slow depolarization, graded depolarization. From what? From minus 70 to minus 60. Ionic explanation, sodium leak channels. Are we following? Everything, there is a meaning, numbers, and ionic explanation. You need to know this. What's the magic number? Minus 60. Why minus 60 is a magic number? Threshold for sodium gated channels to open. If you reach it, gated sodium channels open, and you get to number 2. What's the number 2? Rapid depolarization. Ionic explanation. Gated sodium channels already open. So going up all the way until you get to 3. What's 3? Positive 30. Yeah, what happened here? Ionic explanation. Sodium channels inactive, potassium channels active. And then you go down to repolarization, which is this purple and blue. What's the ionic explanation for this? Potassium channels open, potassium rush in. And then what's 4? Hyperpolarization. Okay, now look at this. See this period here, from here to here? If a stimulus come here, or here, or here, or here, until this point here, nothing is going to happen. So what is this area here? Absolute refraction. Did you get it? How about if you come after that, during the blue? This is relative refractory. So if it is strong enough, it can respond. Did you get this whole graph? So just repeating again. And then propagation. So now the action potential is formed. You are going to reverse and go back to the normal condition electrically and chemically. Is that clear enough? Clear? Okay. So now I'm back to normal. What is going to happen to this electrical current that's created, the action potential? It's going to propagate in one direction, as I mentioned. It's propagating down the axon. What kind of propagation is that? Which one is faster, myelinated or unmyelinated? Is it faster to go down myelinated axon or unmyelinated? Myelinated. Why? Because jumping. But what's the name for jumping? Saltatory. I mentioned that yesterday. Saltatory. So saltatory is faster, like a rabbit, like a rabbit. Continuous is like a turtle. This is the slow one. So continuous propagation is the slow one. Saltatory, it happened in myelinated, and this is the fast one because you jump from, what do you call it? This area interrupted that doesn't have myelin. What do you call it? There is patch of myelin, a small axon, another patch. What do you call this small uncovered axon? This part. There is a name for it. Are you following with me? Anybody? What do you call it? Myelin, interruption, axon is here. You can see it. And then another patch of myelin. What do you call this? Node. Node of what? Ranvier. Node of Ranvier. I think it's a French name or something, but this is what the name. So you jump from node to node to node to node. Okay? Saltatory fast. Is that the only thing that determine how fast? No, this is the most important thing. But there is another thing, another factor that determine how fast you move down the neuron. What is that factor? The diameter. The diameter. If the diameter is large, you go faster. If the diameter is small, you go slower. So we have two factors now, right? You ask yourself, if I'm asking you, what's the speed of propagation in this axon? You ask me two questions before answering. Is it myelinated or not? Is the diameter large or small? So what do you think the fastest? Which one? Which combination? Myelinated, unmyelinated, large, small diameter. Myelinated large. This is the fastest, right? In between will be large unmyelinated or small myelinated, right? This is in between. What's the slowest? Small unmyelinated. Did you get this? So we have three categories now. Fastest, intermediate, slow. Clear? Fastest, large diameter unmyelinated. Intermediate, large diameter unmyelinated or small myelinated. Last category, this is the slowest of all, small diameter and unmyelinated. You got the two bads. Okay, so these are the three different types of neuron, which is type A, type B, type C. Type A is the fastest. Type B is in the middle. Type C is the slowest type. So type A is obviously myelinated and large diameter. This is type A, the fastest. But I want you to know where do we utilize each one of those. I have three types, A, B, C. Which one is the best? The best, which is the fastest. A. Which one in the middle? B. Which one is the bad one, the slow one? C. So because of that, we are going to utilize them depending on the importance of that area, right? Let me say it this way, just practical example. I give you a brand new car and I ask you like to use it for delivery of certain things. And then I give you an old car and then I give you a bike. Okay. And then I ask you the most important things, use this car, right? If something that's 50-50, use the old car. If there is something that's slow, like they are okay, they can wait, use the bike, right? So depending on the importance, we are going to utilize the three types. So I want you to know where do we use each one of those. So for the type A, which is the fastest, sensory information for position and balance. Because if you lost your sensation of balance, you're going to fall. This is extremely important. Okay, so you cannot use any other type. You have to use the best quality types of fibers, type A, because it's position and balance, very important. Okay, and also motor impulse to skeletal muscles. This is type A. How about type B? This is in the middle. It has its own uses. That's intermediate. The slow one is most sensory information. What do you mean most sensory information? Other types of information. That's not what. What's the sensory information that we have to use type A? Balance and position. Balance and position. Put this aside. Balance and position. This is type A. Other sensations, not that important. If you touch something, right? If there is something that's slightly painful, you're not in rush. Let me give you practical examples of these types. If I step on a nail, right? This is something that's very important beside the balance and the position. But this is something that needs immediate reaction, right? You have to move right away. So what kind of of neuron should I use? Type A, right? How about this? What if I'm having a little bit of pain, continuous pain in my knee? Are we in a rush for your brain to like there is a little bit of pain? So what, right? What's urgent about that? Did you get the idea? If it is, we call it the dull aching pain, like it's nagging pain, it's aching. Yes, but it's not urgent. But the cut, severe pain, sudden pain, type A. And it's common sense. Just think about it, right? If you step on something, you have to take an immediate reaction. But if your knee is hurting, what kind of immediate reaction should you get, right? So that would be type C. I can give you, I will actually, not just can. I'll give you examples of this. Balance, position, cut or sharp cut pain, for example. Of course, you should remember that this is urgent, so you have to use type A. Continuous pain, that's mild or vague pain or nagging pain. Yes, this is type C. Type B is in the middle, and you don't have to know exactly what it is. It's good enough to know A and C. And B will be something in between. Now, synapse. Synapse is what I talked about before, the end of one neuron. Remember in the muscles, we talked about the end of one neuron and then the muscle. Do you remember this? And there is a gap in between the synapse. Here we are talking about the nervous system, not the muscles. So it's exactly the same idea, by the way. If you understand the first one, you will understand this. It's the end of the neuron and the beginning of another neuron. And instead of end of the of the neuron and muscle. You get it? The first one is called neuromuscular junction. This one is called just synapse between neuron and neuron. What's the difference? Almost no difference. You will see it. So the neuron that's before the synapse is called presynaptic. The neuron that's after the synapse is called postsynaptic. Of course, you move from pre to post. Okay? Now, the vast majority of the connections between these neurons are the ones that contain a gap. Okay? Here is the end, gap, beginning of another one. This is the vast majority, and this is our focus. However, know that there are exceptions that they touch each other. And if it touch each other, we call that electrical synapse. That's not a lot. This is exception. Okay? There is a direct physical contact. Do I need anything here? If there is physical contact, do I need to release acetylcholine and crossing the gap and all that stuff? Of course not. It's continuous, wire to wire. There is nothing needed. But this is exception. This is minor. The major are the chemical synapse in which you are going to mediate, or you're going to use acetylcholine to move from the presynapse to the postsynapse. We call that chemical synapse. So electrical synapse is when those two are in direct contact with each other, and they are locked to each other. So ions can move from the pre to the post because they touch each other. And in this one, it's located in the brain, in the eye, and ciliary ganglion. Yes, remember these exceptions because the chemical is everywhere else. Okay? Electrical synapse is an exception. Where? Brain, eye, ciliary ganglia. How about the chemical? Everywhere else. This is the exception. So you need to remember this. Where do we have these electrical synapses? Chemical synapses everywhere else. And this is where we have the presynaptic, the postsynaptic, and in between synaptic cleft. Does this look familiar to you? The end of the neuron here, and you have the mitochondria, you have the synaptic vesicles containing acetylcholine, you have a gap, you have postsynapse. Does it sound familiar? Does it look familiar? It is exactly the same as the neuromuscular junction. The only difference is, do you see this gray right here? This one used to be the motor end plate in the previous chapters. This used to be in the muscle. Here, it's another neuron. That's otherwise everything else is the same. Clear? So chemical synapses can be neuron to neuron, and this is our focus. But there are other types, neuromuscular, we talked about it, neuroglandular, same thing, but between the end of the neuron and the beginning of the ganglion of the gland. Now, the chemical one, the regular one. What's going to happen here? It's exactly the same that we talked about before. Okay, which is, let's go back here and just let me tell you what you should know. Here it is. Just as a reminder, and you should remember this. Remember, we created an action potential, right? It's moving down here. What's the sequence? You will be asked about the sequence. Body, axon hillock, initial segment. Are you guys following with me? Axon hillock, I mean body, or dendritis, body, axon hillock, initial segment, axon, collaterals, telodendria, synaptic terminals, or axon terminals. Is that clear? So where are we here? We are at the telodendria. Remember the telodendria? Followed by the synaptic knobs right here. Synaptic knobs, synaptic terminals, axon terminals, three names, same thing. So you are at this level here. What's going to happen? Electrical signal come all the way to here. It will find the gap. Electrical signal cannot cross the gap, right? It cannot cross it. The electrical synapse, there is no gap. There is actually a gap, but there is a connection, okay? There is a direct physical contact. Here, no. So what are you going to do? Electrical signal come all the way down here, opening the gates for calcium. Calcium moves in. And what's the calcium going to do? Push the vesicles containing acetylcholine. Do you see the green vesicles? Containing acetylcholine. Calcium will push it to the gap. It will empty its contents, the acetylcholine. And acetylcholine is going to cross the gap, interact with acetylcholine receptors on the other side, and the postsynapse. And this will create another action potential in the postsynapse. Same exact thing. So this is a chemical synapse, right? Because who created the action potential in the postsynapse? Did it go like electrical to electrical? No. There is a chemical mediator, which is acetylcholine. When it crosses the gap, interact with receptors, acetylcholine receptors, this will result in sodium leak, and then sodium channels open, sodium rush in, and the whole cycle, okay? So the only difference is the postsynapse here is not a muscle. It can be a muscle, it can be a gland, it can be anything else. Okay, now, um, isn't it different when few acetylcholine release, cross the gap, interact with the receptors, opening the gates for sodium, as compared to a lot of acetylcholine released, opening more uh, gates, right? So this will result in different response depending on the amount of neurotransmitter and the sensitivity of the postsynapse. It's not equal. If you release 50 units of acetylcholine crossing the gap, interacting with the receptor, creating a little bit of action potential versus 500 acetylcholine crossing the gap doing the same thing, it gives different results. The amount of neurotransmitter. Is that it? No. Some postsynaptic uh, or some postsynapse is sensitive and some are not very sensitive. So you have two factors now, the amount of neurotransmitter and the sensitivity of the postsynapse. If you are using acetylcholine, which is the vast majority, I give this I give this chemical gap or chemical synapse, I give it a name of the acetylcholine. So what do we call the synapse? It's a chemical synapse. You're using a chemical compound. Are we following? Is that clear? What are you doing here? What are you using in this synapse? I'm using a chemical. What is that chemical? Most of the time, it's acetylcholine. If you're using acetylcholine, you call it cholinergic synapse. Just you give the name to that synapse. Okay? Cholinergic, coming from choline, which is acetylcholine. Where is that located? And you need to know this location of these ones that are using acetylcholine. All neuron to neuron. When you have a neuron and another neuron, automatically you're using acetylcholine. Many synapses in the CNS, all neuromuscular junction, or neuromuscular and neuroglandular parasympathetic. We didn't talk about the parasympathetic yet, but you will see it coming when we talk about the autonomic nervous system. But you do need to know which synapse, which chemical synapse use acetylcholine. And that's why you call it cholinergic. All neuromuscular junction, all neuron to neuron, all neuromuscular, neuroglandular parasympathetic. Translation, translation. It's almost everything except except sympathetic that we will talk about and another exception. But if you don't want to memorize it, it's everything minus the sympathetic and another exception that I will talk about. What exactly happened? I talked about it right here. Do you guys remember this? Action potential come. When the action potential reach the synaptic knobs here or the synaptic terminals, what's the first thing that will happen? If you guys are following with me, action potential reached here. What's the first step? Huh? What is the first step? Action potential reached the synaptic terminal right here. What's the first step? Calcium moves in, pushing the, not the sodium, the vesicles, synaptic vesicles, pushing it to the gap here. What's going to be released? What will be released? Acetylcholine. And what are these? What's the pink here? Acetylcholine receptors. Yes. Acetylcholine cross the gap, interact with receptors. Look at these chemically gated sodium channels will move in, creating an action potential in the postsynapse. Now, what is the fate of acetylcholine? And this will be a question. What is the fate of acetylcholine? Do we just leave it there? What happened to it? Recycle it. Using what enzyme? What's the name of the enzyme? It almost have the same name. What's the name of the enzyme that break down and then recycle acetylcholine? It have the same name plus something. Yes, acetylcholine esterase. Acetylcholine esterase. You have to remember this name. So the enzyme is acetylcholine esterase. What is it going to do? Acetylcholine, break it down into acetyl and choline, right? Which one is recycled? What do you think? If you still remember, we talked about this before. Is it the acetyl or the choline? Which one is the important one? Choline is the one that's going to be recycled. Acetyl, we don't care about it. Look at this. The choline is the one that's going to be recycled. It will go back. You add acetate to it, rebuilding acetylcholine. Now, synaptic delay, this is something that we talked about in the muscle. This looks like you guys forgot all of these details. But do you remember this delay, the latent period? Do you remember this? It doesn't go continuously. You have to stop at the synaptic terminals. And then calcium moves in, pushing the vesicles, releasing acetylcholine, crossing the gap, interacting with receptors. Doesn't this take some time? Right? So we call it the synaptic delay, and this is about half millisecond. Almost nothing, but for physiology, it is something. So this is called the synaptic delay. Synaptic fatigue is if you cannot catch up. If you do this and then you break down acetylcholine and then we recycle it, right? Are we following? Push acetylcholine, interact, break it down, recycle it, right? Next cycle, same thing. What if you cannot catch up? Like the speed of recycling is not does not match with the stimulus, fatigue. We call that fatigue, okay? Because what if another stimulus come? It will push acetylcholine out. What you don't have acetylcholine yet because you're not catching up. Yes, because of the delay. There is a delay, and the time that it takes to recycle. Okay, did you get the idea? You break it down, you recycle it. If you give it enough time, it will be filled up, and then if another signal come, you can start the process again. Is that clear? This is like this. Let me just make it simple. I give you a cup of water, you drink it, you give it back to me. I gave you another cup of water. If you give me the time, I'll give it to you. But if you give me water, give me water, give me water, I don't have time. I'm not going to give you anything, right? Because your speed of asking exceeds my ability. Here, the speed of stimulus exceeds the ability to recycle. So at certain point, it will come and there is no acetylcholine. You're not giving the time to recycle. Now, all what we talked about so far, that we are assuming that acetylcholine cross the gap, act with the receptor, opening the gates for sodium, creating action potential in the postsynapse. Is this point clear? Okay, this is the vast majority. Is it 100% of the time? No, it's not 100% of the time. Sometimes when the neurotransmitter cross the gap, interact with the receptor, which gates are we supposed to open? When acetylcholine cross the gap and interact with receptor, opening gates for what? For sodium. And that should create action potential, right? What if this postsynapse response is to open the gates for potassium instead? This is not depolarization, right? Instead, you are creating hyperpolarization. You're making it even harder for you. Did you get the idea? Let me explain it this way. Here is acetylcholine, cross the gap, interact with receptors, a little bit of sodium moves in, slow depolarization, ready for the fast, right? So now this is called excitatory neurotransmitter because it starts to excite the postsynapse. Some postsynapse, some receptors are not going to do that. When acetylcholine cross a gap, go to these receptors, the receptors instead are going to open the gates for potassium, which is the opposite. So this is called inhibitory because you're going to, instead of depolarizing, you're hyperpolarizing. This is called inhibitory neurotransmitter. So some neurotransmitters are excitatory, some neurotransmitters are inhibitory. Now, what kinds of neurotransmitter do we have? We have many types. Acetylcholine, I keep on talking about acetylcholine because this is the most important, most common one. But there are other ones. They can be amines, amino acids, neuropeptides. It can be even gases. So what are the important ones besides acetylcholine? What else that we need to know? What are the other neurotransmitters? Norepinephrine is one. What did we call the synapse that use acetylcholine? What did you call it? Synapse using acetylcholine. What do you call it? Choline, cholinergic, cholinergic, right? If you're using acetylcholine, what we call it? Cholinergic. If you're using adrenaline or norepinephrine, we call it adrenergic. What if you're using dopamine? Dopaminergic. Is that clear? The neurotransmitter decide the name. You're using acetylcholine, cholinergic. You're using adrenaline, adrenergic. You're using dopamine, dopaminergic. You're using serotonin, serotonergic. Beside the neurotransmitters, there are other chemicals that are called neuromodulators. We finished the neurotransmitters. There are different types. You need to know what do we call the synapse. If you're using others, cholinergic, adrenergic, GABAminergic, serotonergic, and so on. Neuromodulators, these are chemicals that modulate the neurotransmitter release. Okay? Neuromodulators are chemicals that modulate the rate of neurotransmitter release. The neurotransmitter is not working like completely free or completely random. It is modulated through the neuromodulators. What are these neuromodulators? It can be something like neuropeptides. It can be opioids. Opioids. It's opioids similar to what? Opium. Do we know opium? Morphine, heroin, right? So what's opioid? Opium, oid. Oid means similar to. It is chemical in our body, kind of similar to morphine or similar to opium. So do you mean that we have something like internal morphine? Yes, we do have something that's similar to morphine inside our body, and this is completely normal. Okay? It's not called morphine though. It's called enkephalin, endorphin, dynorphin. And all of them end with fen. Okay? Fen, endorphin, dynorphin, enkephalin. Okay? So it sounds like morphine, but it is something internal. Do we have that in our body? Yes, we do. And this is what give us like a little bit of tolerance to pain. It give us a little bit of joy. We feel like good a little bit. We do have. It's not as strong as morphine, but it's something intrinsic inside our body. And we call that opioid. Opium, oid, similar to opium. Enkephalin, endorphin, dynorphin. Sometimes we use gases as neurotransmitters. nitric oxide, carbon monoxide. These can be used as neurotransmitter. Okay, nitric oxide is used for muscular vasodilation. If this nitric oxide work, it will cause vasodilation. And by the way, nitric oxide is the base of Viagra and Cialis and all these things. They work on this. Okay, if you're interested to know, it's nitric oxide. Viagra, Cialis, magic. What does it do? It's just neurotransmitter. Release more nitric oxide, increasing the vasodilation and augmenting the erection. And this is nitric oxide. So it works through nitric oxide. Most of the time, these neurotransmitters, they work directly, like acetylcholine. But sometimes it work indirectly, like work through G protein, like epinephrine and norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin. Let me say this. Epinephrine is adrenaline, just another name. You will see it coming a lot. Epinephrine, adrenaline. Norepinephrine, noradrenaline. What are these? Sympathetic neurotransmitter. Do you remember sympathetic? Fight, fright, flight. If you are in this situation, what do you use? Epinephrine, norepinephrine. Another name, adrenaline, noradrenaline. Why? It's the same name. Epi means above. Nephron means kidney. Ad means above. Renal means kidney. It's the same thing because it comes from the gland above the kidney. Adrenaline. Epinephrine. Same thing. Epi, above. Renal nephron, kidney. It's released from the gland above the kidney. That's why it's the same name. So don't be confused if you see, like, if you release norepinephrine, we call the synapse here adrenergic. Why didn't you call it like epinephrinaergic or something, right? Epinephrine, adrenaline is the same, so it's okay to use it. It sounds easier. So here is acetylcholine binding the receptors, opening the gates for sodium, sodium moving in, or sometimes it works indirectly through G protein. If you work through G protein indirectly, it will work as the first neurotransmitter, and then you're going to release something else called second neurotransmitter, or second messenger. And this second messenger can be cyclic A&P most of the time. The enzyme here is called adenylate cyclase. If you didn't understand this, I will say it again. Acetylcholine, cross the gap, interact with receptor, open the gates. That's it. Okay? This is a direct way of working. This is for acetylcholine. The others, they work in a slightly different way, not that direct way. Same thing, release, cross the gap, interact with receptors. Opening the gates? No. No. There are two more steps. We call it indirectly. Are we following? Cross the gap, interact with receptors, open the gates? No, not yet. Not that fast, not that direct, like acetylcholine. You're going to interact with something called G protein. G protein will activate adenyl cyclase, releasing cyclic A&P, which is called the second messenger. So you will have two more steps. And then what? Opening the gates. You will open the gates anyway, directly or indirectly. Look at this here. In this case, neurotransmitter come, interact with receptors. Opening the gates? No, not yet. You have to activate G protein, activating adenyl cyclase, making cyclic A&P, which is the second messenger, and this is the one that's going to open the gates. And we call it indirectly. Sometimes intracellular enzymes can work through these gases like nitric oxide and carbon monoxide, and I talked about this. Information processing. Information processing is then what? Like all what we're talking about, where we're talking about so far is how you overcome this issue of end of one neuron, gap, and then the other neuron. You already did. You already did. You created action potential in the postsynapse. Then what? The postsynapse is going to react. And we call that information processing. How is it going to react? Either excitatory or inhibitory. This is the information processing. Um, so there will be excitatory postsynaptic potential and inhibitory postsynaptic potential. The potential that's created in the postsynapse, it can be excitatory, it can be inhibitory. Excitatory F, you open the gates for sodium. Inhibitory F, you open the gates for potassium. Clear? Excitatory, the postsynaptic potential. Excitatory, if you open the gates for sodium. Inhibitory, if you open the gates for potassium. Why? Because if you open the gates for sodium, you will create an action potential, which is depolarization, right? You're creating an action potential. This is excitation. But if you open the gates for potassium, no depolarization. You will create hyperpolarization, and we call that inhibitory postsynaptic potential. So what if we have both of them? I know this part is not easy, okay? But again, I'm trying to, it's not going to be simple anyway. I'm trying to simplify it as much as possible, okay? But at the end, I know it's not something easy, okay? So if you cross the gap, act with the receptor, opening the gates for sodium is excitatory, okay? For this one, cross the gap, act with receptors. Instead, you're opening the gates for potassium, hyperpolarization. This is inhibitory. Which one do we actually have? You can have excitatory, you can have inhibitory, and actually you can have both of them. Excitatory and inhibitory. Yes, it yes, it can happen at the same time. And if that's the case, which one is more? Right? Meaning, I can push this door out. This is one way. Or I can push it in. This is another way. Or I can push out and you're pushing in at the same time. And what's the result? Which one of us is stronger, right? If I'm stronger than you, I will push it open. You got it? So if excitatory is more than inhibitory, what's the result? Excitation. What's the inhibitory is more than excitatory? Inhibition. Did you get the idea? So you can have any one of those. So still with the information processing, when something cross the gap, when a neurotransmitter cross the gap, go to the postsynapse, interact with receptor, do the work. If you do that several times, you're getting different results because this is called summation. What's summation? Sum. You're adding things, adding up. And there are two ways of this summation that we need to understand. And here is the summation. Look at this. If I wanted to break this, okay, there are different ways to do it. I can get a hammer and keep on hitting the same spots so many times until I break it down. Or five of us with five hammers, one hit, we break it down. This is two different ways of adding up the force. Did you get it? This is two ways. So the first one is called temporal summation. Temporal means time, like time after time after time after time. Temporal summation. Me alone getting the hammer and hitting. That's adding up summation. It will give you the result. Spatial summation is many stimuli coming at the same time. 5, 10 of us with 5 hammers hit, spatial summation. Look at this picture here. Which one is this? Temporal or spatial? You give a signal here, you give a signal here. It's in the same spot, it's 1. This is temporal. You do it once, you do it twice, it gets stronger. Look at this. This is more than 1 at the same time. This is spatial summation. So adding up excitatory and inhibitory, it will result either excitation or inhibition. But we call it facilitation or inhibition if you're adding those up, depending on which one is more. If this synapse is between 2 axons, we call it axo-axonic. And it means it's, look at this. So far, I was talking about the yellow ending and going to the purple, right? Are we following this? Here is dendritis, body, axon, all the way until terminals, and then dendritis is the next one, right? And then body and so on. But you can actually go, instead of going to the dendritis, you can go to the axon. You can work on the axon instead. And we call that axo-axonic, from axon to axon. Okay, so this is the whole thing combined that we talked about. And that will be it for this chapter. For this chapter.